Hey team, we're going to learn how to create pages in Next.js, including static pages and dynamic pages using all the Next.js data fetching methods like getStaticProps, getServerSideProps, and getStaticPaths. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and that little bell icon to make sure you get notified on future tutorials. Starting off, if you're not familiar, Next.js is a React framework that comes with a lot of awesome features built on top of React, including things like routing and data fetching, and things that make it a great way to build applications or websites. Now, one of the features is Pages, where it uses file system routing, where we're able to easily create whatever route we want to do by just creating that file inside of the Pages directory. On top of page creation, we have things like dynamic routes, where we can take a parameter as an argument right inside of that route so that we can create our one file to have a variety of pages with that same kind of context. And on top of that, we have a variety of options for data fetching for those pages, where we have getStaticProps, which helps us fetch data at build time, as we see here. You have getStaticPaths, which help us actually determine what pages are going to get built to pass in those props. And then finally, we have getServerSideProps, which provides us SSR or server-side rendering so that we can make sure that each request to the server for the page is going to be dynamic and that request will happen on the server. So to bring this all together, we're going to work through a couple practical examples where we'll step through things like creating a basic static page with no data. Then we'll create a static page where we're going to fetch that data using getStaticProps at compile time. And then finally, we'll create a server-side page where we're going to have that dynamic request every single time that page actually reloads. So to actually get started with our Next.js application, we're going to use create next app, which allows us to easily spin up a new application and start diving right in. We're also going to use the Last Airbender API, which is just a fun way for us to have dynamic data to work with when we're actually making these requests to create all of our pages. So to get started inside of my terminal, I'm going to run yarn create next app, and I'm going to call that my Last Airbender wiki. What that's going to do is in the background, it's going to clone down the default Next.js project. It's going to install all the dependencies and even reset Git to make sure that we're able to start off running. But once that's done, I can cd into my new directory and I can run yarn dev, which is going to spin up a local development server where I can open that up right inside of my browser, and Next.js will start going away to actually compile the pages that are existing inside of that default template, where now we can see that I have my default Next.js application. Now, starting to actually just poke around inside of this application, we can see we already have this pages directory, where inside we have a few files where importantly what we want to look at is this index.js, where this index.js is going to be our home page, which is exactly that page that we just saw, where it's pretty much a simple React component where it's going to include all the content that we want, and it's going to provide us ways that we can actually provide dynamic fetching methods, which we'll see shortly here. Now, if I instead wanted to create my own new page, as I mentioned earlier, it uses file system based routing. So right inside of Pages, I'm going to create a new file called about.js. And let's say we're going to export a default function, and we're going to call that function about, where inside I'm going to simply return a div, where inside of that div, let's call an h1 and we'll say about this wiki. Now, this is a really simple option, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on actually styling this because the point here is just to show how the actual page creation works. But if we go to our browser and we go to the About page, we can see that Next.js is going to load that page and we see our About This wiki. So not only do we want to create a static page like this, we want to also pull in some dynamic data into that page. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to simply duplicate this existing one because it's also going to be a similar base file, but I'm going to call this avatars.js, where inside, let's first update that function name, avatars, and inside I'm going to say that I want this to be my avatars header, where inside I'm going to simply display a list of avatars, including Aang, but I want to do so dynamically so that I can make sure I'm pulling in all of the avatars for my API. Now, to start off, the way that we're going to fetch the data inside of Next.js is we're going to use the getStaticProps function. And to do that, underneath our function, let's say export async function getStaticProps, and inside we're ultimately going to return an object where that object has a props property where we're going to be able to define any of our data for that function. The great thing is now that we have this getStaticProps function, we can add any kind of request we want right inside, where it's ultimately going to take that data and we're going to return it inside of this props object, which we're going to be able to make available for our component here. Now, I know that this is a little bit hard to read, but we want to look for the avatar route, where we're going to be able to get all of our avatars. And we can even open this up in an example where we can see exactly that endpoint getting hit, where we have an array with objects of a bunch of our different avatars throughout the different series. So inside of my getStaticProps function, I'm going to say constant avatars, and I'm going to say I want to await the fetch function, where inside of fetch, I'm going to pass in that avatar's endpoint, including the domain along with the path to that endpoint, where ultimately we have access to the fetch API because Next.js actually polyfills that whenever it's not available, including on inside of Node, where this data is going to get fetched. But finally, I'm also going to chain on a then command where I'm going to pass in the response and simply say that I want to take that response and send it to JSON, so that way our avatars is actually an array of data that we'll be able to use. Now, before we even pass this in as a prop, we can take this avatars and we can console log it right inside of this function. So now instead of this about page, if we go to avatars, we'll see that we have our page where currently we only have Ang because we only have that static list. But if we look inside of our terminal, because that data fetching is happening on Node, inside of Node, we can see all of that data being logged right inside of our terminal. So now I can pass in my avatars right inside as a prop, where inside of my actual component for my avatars page, I'm going to now make that available. So we can see here that those props correlate to the actual props inside of my page component, where now instead of just simply listing out Ang just by himself, I'm going to now take those avatars and I'm going to map through each avatar, where I'm going to say that I want to return a list item with that avatar.name and close that list item. But then also, because we're in React, we want to make sure we provide a key on each of those fields. And in this instance, it's going to be avatar._id. But now we can also get rid of that static Ang. And once we reload the page, we can see that we're now dynamically filling up that entire list with all of the avatars that we've seen throughout the series. And just for a quick review, what we were able to do is not only set up a new page where we can contain all of our avatars, we were able to take this getStaticProps function, which allowed us to actually make a request to that API, fetch all that data, turn it into JSON, put it inside of an avatar's constant, and actually make it available as a prop, where this page, because we're using getStaticProps, is going to be statically compiled with all that data, as opposed to actually being server-side rendered, where it's going to send all that HTML with the first request. Now this is great, where we're able to easily get that list of data and actually iterate through it. But what if we wanted to create a new page for every single character inside of the avatar ecosystem? So for this example, we're going to use the characters API. So inside of pages, I'm going to create a directory where I'm going to call that directory characters. And inside to start, I'm going to call that file Cora.js. Now, like before, we can simply grab our about page or whatever we want, and we can add our Cora here, where let's say that we're going to fill in her name of Cora. And while this alone looks like a completely static page, which it is, we're going to learn how we can transform this into a dynamic route. So to start, when building Cora's page, I don't want to have to statically add her name inside of each one. Instead, I want this to be a character template. So I'm going to first rename that component to character, where we're going to dynamically fill in this data. Now, to actually look up Cora's information, we're going to use this endpoint where we can search on the character's name. And just a quick note, it's not the perfect way of doing this because using search as a way of getting that character isn't an exact identifier, and it can come with unexpected results. But just for the sake of this example, we're going to use this because it's an easy way for us to be able to navigate to the pages to see how this actually works. So here, if we open up an example, we can see similar before that we're going to actually get that payload with the request, but let's see if we search for Cora, we can see that we get Cora's actual result here. So to start, let's copy that URL. And like we did in the last example, we're going to start off by exporting a new async function called getStaticProps. What we're going to do inside is we're going to create a new constant, but this one we're going to call results, because if we saw before with the search, we're going to be given an array that's going to be returned, where for this, we're going to use the first result of that array. So I'm going to say I want to set that equal to await, where I'm going to use fetch just like before, and then I'm going to chain on my then, where I'm going to take the response and turn that response into JSON. But then finally on the next line, I'm going to say that I want to return my props, where inside I'm going to say that I want my character to be results and that 0 index to get that first character. Now, like before, we now will have that character data available, so I'm going to make that as a prop inside of my character page here, where I can now change that h1 to character.name. But now if I go to /characters/Cora, we can see that we now get Cora's name, and we're doing that dynamically. Now, just as a quick note of something that I didn't mention before, if we saw before we created that avatars path where that's going to be /avatars, but we just saw here that we created a nested route, meaning we created a directory with a file inside of it. So now that's going to be equal to characters/Cora when we actually visit the path. Now inside, we also have some additional data. So why don't we make this a little bit more fun and let's add the image and maybe even the affiliation. So above my h1, I'm going to add an image, and I'm going to say I want the source to be equal to character.photo URL, which is that property that we just saw. And we want to always add an alt, which for this case, it's going to be the same as the character name. So and we don't have the context of the photo itself, so we can just leave that empty. But then finally, maybe we can add the affiliation. Where underneath my header, I'm going to say I'm going to add a paragraph tag, and I want my affiliation to be character.affiliation. And now as soon as the page refreshes, we can see we have our picture of Cora, we have our name still, and we have that affiliation all being dynamically added from getStaticProps. Now this is really great, but we want to be able to do this for any characters. For example, I want to be able to go to /ang, character/ang, and be able to get Aang there, or really Suki or Appa or anybody else from this show. So this is where getStaticPaths and dynamic routes come in, where we're going to be able to take a list of all of the different characters we want to make available, tell Next.js that we want all those characters to have pages individually for them inside of getStaticPaths, and we're going to set up this route to be dynamic so that we can pass that ID or the name in as a parameter for us to actually make this search request for inside of getStaticProps. So to start, we're going to use the characters endpoint so that we can get all characters, but by default, it only has 20 per page. So we're also going to tack on an additional parameter for per page, where if we look at the example here, we can see that it opens up where this one has per page of 10. I'm going to change that to 500 because there's slightly under 500 characters, but that way we can have a page for every single character. But now I'm going to copy that URL, and back inside my code, I'm going to now export a new async function below getStaticProps, and I'm going to call that getStaticPaths, where this is going to function very similar to getStaticProps, except we're going to create an array of paths instead of passing in the props themselves. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to get all the characters. So I'm going to say constant characters is equal to await fetch, and I'm going to pass in that URL that we just saw for the 500 characters, and then just like before, I'm going to tack on my then. I'm going to say I want it to turn into JSON. So next, instead of returning props, we're going to return paths. So I'm going to say return our new object, and inside that, I'm going to determine that I'm going to want to define my paths, where I'm going to want to map through this characters array. So I'm going to say characters.map, and then for each character, I want to return a new object configuration where inside of that, I want to define my params, which is going to be those dynamic values that we're able to get from the path, where in this case, we're going to set it up to be character ID so that we can actually specify what that character ID is going to be. And in this instance, let's call it character.name. Now, when we're actually setting up this parameter, we need to make sure that we're providing it as a parameter inside of the actual file for our routing. So in this case, we want to change Cora. Instead of the name directly, we're going to use brackets, and we're going to wrap character ID with those brackets because we're telling Next.js that we want that to be a dynamic value, where we can see that the character ID as our param is going to be the param inside of this file name and ultimately our page route. So what's going to happen is Next.js is going to use getStaticPaths, see that this is an actual dynamic route, and it's going to say it's going to loop through all these paths, and it's going to know that we have this dynamic parameter, and for this, we're setting what that's going to be for each one, so it knows ahead of time which different routes to actually render. Now, as one last thing, we have to also define a fallback value here on this getStaticPaths return object, which is going to say whether or not we want to handle the situation where the parameter is not found. And in this case, let's just say that we want a 404 or say it's not found if we don't have one. So we're going to say fallback is false. But next, once Next.js goes through all these paths and try to render the page, we're going to be able to run getStaticProps for each page, where that's going to ultimately take in the params that we'll use to fetch that dynamic data. So inside of this function, we're going to destructure an argument called params. where with my params, I'm going to be able to get that same character ID value from that object because that correlates directly one-to-one when I'm passing in those dynamic parameters. So I'm going to first turn this into a template literal statement for my actual URL so that at the end here, instead of passing in name as Cora, I can say that I want to pass in a variable, and that's going to be params.character ID. So now if I refresh the page for Cora, we can see that it's actually not existing. Now, if we look at the URL here, we can see that we're passing in Cora with a lowercase k, and that's going to be the issue because if we look inside the data, the name value is actually an uppercase K. And now, if we try to go to that URL inside of Chrome right here, it's not going to actually refresh the page. But if we go to localhost 3000/characters and we actually go to a new page with the uppercase K, we can see that it is going to indeed find Cora. Now, we have ways to actually start fixing this inside of our code. First of all, we can normalize our values, our character IDs that we're passing through. So for instance, if I want to make sure that that Cora is always with a lowercase k, I can say that I'm going to create my character ID, where I'm going to set that equal to character.name.toLowerCase. And then I can pass in that character ID right as is right into the params object. But now once my original Cora page loads, we can see that it's working just as expected again. We can even see that this works just the same if we change this to Eng, or if we change this to Appa, or Suki, or whatever character we want. Now the only trick here though is we're using single word names here. Now if we wanted to see someone like Cabbage Merchant, we can see that inside the URL it's getting parsed as a %20, which is the encoded version of a space, meaning we're still seeing that it's working, but that's not necessarily a normal term or normal URL that we'd want to see. So we can also fix that. So with our character name, not only can we set it to go to lowercase, we can also say that we want to replace any instance of a space where this is going to be a regex value, and we want to set a G to make that a global regex value, and we're going to replace that with a dash. So when Next.js actually goes through and gets all that character data and turns it into a list of params, it's instead going to see cabbage-merchant. Now the only trick here is that params value here is going to include that dash, and the API in that search isn't going to recognize that dash. So the last thing that we only need to do is replace those dashes back with something the API will actually understand, and that'll be the plus sign. So we can say on the params.character ID, I'm going to perform a similar replace where I'm going to use the slash, and I'm going to actually escape that hyphen so that I can say I want to replace all of those with a plus sign because the API will understand that, and I want to make sure I do that globally. But now if we actually replace that %20 with a hyphen, we can see that we can go to cabbage-merchant, and it works perfectly well. It was able to find that and request all the data for that character. So in this example, not only were we able to create our static page, we were able to dynamically fetch data for that page, but we were also able to dynamically create a wide variety of paths so that we can make a bunch of different pages available for Next.js to create, not just one single file, but by using dynamic routes, we can now visit any character we want as a character path. Now finally, what we did so far was all static, where these are statically generated pages that are going to be HTML that's served to the person who's actually visiting the site. That way, there's not going to be a request that actually happens when they visit that page in the browser. It's all going to be static. But Next.js also supports the ability to have server-side rendering, meaning when I go to a page in the browser, it's going to go to the server, render that request, and return it back to the browser. So for this example, let's use the affiliations endpoint, where I'm going to say that I want to be able to go to a page similar that we did for characters, but I want to pass in an affiliation ID so that I can go see all the characters that are under that particular affiliation. So to start, I'm going to create a new directory called affiliations. And similar to what we did with character ID, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to say that I want this to be a dynamic value, and I'm going to say I want that to be affiliation ID instead, .js. Now, because this is ultimately going to be a list of characters, I'm going to borrow our avatars request that we did before, and I'm going to simply grab that page itself, and I'm going to rename that to affiliations. And let's say instead of avatars, they're going to be characters that we're going to be able to map through. And I want to say that I want my affiliation matching whatever we're going to pass in as that ID. So I'm going to say affiliation matching, and we're going to pass in that ID later. But once inside the characters array, I want to make sure that I also update the avatar to my character. So if we're imagining how this works, it's going to be very similar to the character ID, where we have this dynamic route and we want to hit a specific route, such as /affiliation/water tribe, where we're able to get all the characters from that tribe. So what we're going to do is we're going to export a new async function, and this time it's going to be called getServerSideProps. Now this function is going to work similar to getStaticProps, where we're going to return an object ultimately that has props with all of our data. Now, like before, we want to make sure we get that endpoint. So I'm going to open up the example, and we can see here that we have this affiliation endpoint where we're going to ultimately pass the name in as the parameter instead of the character ID like we saw before. So inside, I want to say I want my constant characters to equal await fetch, where I'm going to pass in that URL. And again, I'm going to say then, where I'm going to take my response and turn it into JSON. Make sure I get the period. Now, the biggest difference here between getServerSideProps and the static methods is we don't have to use two separate functions. We can use this single server-side-props function because we're getting that parameter dynamically on the server. So just like we did inside of getStaticProps, I can say that I want to grab my params. Now, like we did inside of the character ID, I'm going to create a constant called affiliation ID, where I'm going to set that equal to params.affiliationID, where just like we did inside of getStaticProps, I'm going to say I want to replace, and I'm going to replace a regex where I'm going to replace all the hyphens, because again, we want to bring those params inside as something that's URL friendly, and we don't want to do that globally, and we're going to replace it with the plus sign so that it's search friendly inside of that URL. But ultimately, because it's happening on the server, again, we can get that affiliation ID straight from this method, turn it into our ID, and we're going to now pass it into this URL. So here I'm going to change this like before to the template literal, where I can now change this value to a dynamic variable that's going to be my affiliation ID. And then additionally, I'm going to pass both the characters and my affiliation ID inside as props, so I can take my characters, which are already set to map out, along with my affiliation ID, so I can add that I'm going to have my affiliation matching that value. But now if I go to /affiliations/water, we can see that it's going to load up and I can see all of the characters that match that. I can even grab all that other metadata from inside of the original character, where I can paste that in right inside of my list item. And we shouldn't have multiple H1s, so I'll make that H2. But we can now see that we have our affiliation matching water, and we have pictures and the name and the affiliation of all of our different characters. So just a quick review, we can see that this worked very similar to getStaticProps and getStaticPaths, except we only needed to use this one function. But that's because what's happening is when the server actually sees that request to that specific route, it's going to say, hey, I'm going to take that parameter and I'm going to pass it right into this function, and we can see if we can actually make that data available. We can even see that we're not actually predetermining this ID of water, because we can really now use this URL as a search method, where we can even go to something like Northern Water Tribe, where if we load that, we now only see the result for the Northern Water Tribe. I can even change that to my Southern Water Tribe, where similarly it's going to filter only the people who are related to that tribe. But the great thing about Next.js, we have a ton of options for how we can actually fetch our data. And the great thing is we can mix and match. And if we have one page that we want server-side rendered, and we have others that need to be completely static, we have the ability to do that through our different pages, whether we're using getServerSideProps or getStaticProps and paths, or if we're just creating a static page without any additional data fetching. One of the things that makes Next.js so powerful is its flexibility with data fetching and page creation, where we can be just as dynamic we want, and we can also be just as static as we want. Have you seen any crazy examples or really great use cases for using dynamic routes or even static routes? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about what I actually mean when I say static generation or SSG, check out my video, which you can see the link above, for what is SSG. Or if you want to take this dynamic values to another level where you can use those dynamic values to create your page SEO metadata, check out this video, React SEO with Next.js, using the link above. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe for future updates, and hit that little bell icon to make sure you get notifications for my next tutorial. Thanks for watching.